Welcome to Parsing Propaganda, the show where we deconstruct evangelical articles, videos, or other content. We try to get in depth to point out the insane. We don't critique for the mere sake of being critical, but rather to educate ourselves and our peers on how both subtle and overt cues from Christian leaders are not simply a point of view. The misleading nature used to promote their cause does great harm, so we must be vigilant in pointing out their manipulation. Let's dive in. Welcome to Parsing Propaganda. Today we're going to be reading A Biblical Critique of Secular Justice and Critical Theory by Timothy Keller. And this is an additional article in the series on justice and race by Timothy Keller that includes The Bible and Race, published in March 2020, The Sin of Racism, June 2020, and Justice in the Bible, September of 2020. So I don't quite know when this article came out, but sometime in 2020. And today we have a bit of a critiqueception going on. I'm reacting to a reaction, and thus this activates my anxiety as I dive into the feedback loop from hell. I should warn the listener that this will likely be the driest and longest one of these Parsing Propaganda episodes I do. And so I'm not exactly selling this, am I? But I want to give Keller some attention, though, partially because he is often considered an academic in evangelical circles, and he has a huge influence in Bible classes across the country. He's also a mini celebrity in the denomination in which I was raised, the PCA. I would get into his biography more, but this article is just way too lengthy. The only other contextual thing I'll mention is he is great at seeming progressive to evangelicals and radically conservative to non-believers. So that posture is rather curious, and it makes him quite interesting to listen to. Okay, let's just get into it. He starts, which justice? There have never been stronger calls for justice than those we are hearing today, but seldom do those issuing the calls acknowledge that currently there are competing visions of justice, often at a sharp variance, and that none of them have achieved anything like a cultural consensus. Not even in a single country like the U.S. It is overconfident to assume that everyone will adopt your view of justice rather than some other merely because you say so. Biblical justice. In the Bible, Christians have an ancient, rich, strong, comprehensive, complex, and attractive understanding of justice. Biblical justice differs in significant ways from all the secular alternatives, without ignoring the concerns of any of them. Yet Christians know little about biblical justice, despite its prominence in scriptures. This ignorance is having two effects. First, large swaths of the church still do not see doing justice as part of their calling as individual believers. Second, many younger Christians, recognizing this failure of the church and wanting to rectify things, are taking up one or another of the secular approaches to justice, which introduces distortions into their practice in lives. Okay. Keller packs a lot of big concepts into this introduction, so let me first point out the rather off-putting contradiction here. While it is correct that we cannot all agree on the exact parameters of justice, I would argue there is even less consensus on what the Bible spells out as fair. In parts of the Christian Bible, justice seems to include vengeance, and in others, it is turning the other cheek. Even if the Bible were consistent about its rules, it seems the various interpretations of not only denominations throughout history, but even individuals, is even more contrasting than our secular social contracts. Or even if it's about the same amount of tension, the point becomes moot. Here's where Keller seems admirable, though. He admits that the church has failings in caring about justice, which of course I would believe is an understatement. He seems to respect that younger Christians are fed up with the fact that justice has been ignored in church history, but somewhat reprimands them for doing it the world's way, the classic us versus them paradigm that the evangelical must abide by. We'll continue. No one has done a better job of explaining our current predicament over justice than Alistair McIntyre, especially in his book, Whose Justice? Which Rationality? He shows that behind every understanding of justice is a set of philosophical beliefs about human nature and purpose and morality and practical rationality, how we know things and justify true beliefs. In his book, he traces out 4 basic historical traditions of justice. There is the classical, Homer through Aristotle, the biblical, Augustine through Aquinas, whose accomplishment was to incorporate some of Aristotle, the Enlightenment, especially Locke, Kant, and Hume, which then set the stage for the modern liberal approach, which has fragmented into a number of competing views that struggle with one another in our own day. Okay. That is the briefest of philosophical history that is either purposely or lazily neglectful. And I understand that Keller is quoting someone else, but to only mention one of the pre-Socratics amid ancient Hebrews and Hindus and string together a history that fits well into a Christian narrative is a common move by the evangelical. I mean, karma, the concept of karma, is one of the most consistent principles of justice that way predates any of this. So to categorize types of theories about justice that are only conducive to compare and contrast all neat and tidy with your propaganda, that's not fair or honest. He goes on. Earlier Enlightenment thinkers saw a basis for morality and justice not in God or religion, but one that could be discovered by human reason alone. David Hume did not believe that was possible. He argued that there are no moral norms or absolutes outside of us that we must obey regardless of what we think or feel, and therefore we cannot discover them through reason. Rather, he taught that the only basis for our moral decisions was not reason, but sentiment moral intuitions grounded largely in our own emotions rather than in our thinking. Hume won the field, and today his successors have taken his ideas out to their logical conclusion that all moral claims are culturally constructed and so ultimately based on our feelings and preferences, not on anything objective. But McIntyre shows how problematic this is. The social consensus of morality and justice that Enlightenment thinkers thought they could achieve by leaving religion behind has not been realized. And McIntyre explains why in his famous wristwatch illustration. He shows it is impossible to determine if a watch is a good or bad watch unless you know what it is for. It is for hammering nails or telling you the time of day. Is it for hammering nails or telling you the time of day? Without knowing the telos or purpose of the watch, any evaluation is impossible. Likewise, unless you know what human beings are for, you will never come to any agreement as to what good or bad behavior is and therefore what justice is. The secular view is that human beings are just here through chance. We are not here for any purpose at all. But if that is the case, then there is no good way to argue coherently on secular premises and beliefs about the world, and any particular behavior is wrong or unjust. Human rights are based on nothing more than some people feel they are important. Not everyone does, however. And what do you say to people who don't believe in them and don't honor them? Why should your feelings take precedence over someone else's? After David Hume, no modern theory of justice has any answer other than because we say so. So McIntyre's illustration of a wristwatch, that's a classic hit. I like it. It demonstrates the concept of telos well. The postmodern deconstructionist inside me, who would smoke more weed if it was cheaper, and I got more high when I smoked it. I want to point out that the idea of one purpose for all humanity is pretty close-minded. If each person has their own specific purpose, that could complicate how we get along. But it does not make it dramatically impossible, like most conservative intellects like to make it sound. The theoretical language can distract from the importance of observing the tangible data. Human rights don't have to existentially resolve every justice issue every human who has ever existed ever wrestled through. So do no harm, right, may indeed mean something different to everyone, but it may be achievable to find basic agreements that are close enough for us to function. If not, the best we've come up with so far is majority rules. In retrospect, we have seen that majority of people can make unjust choices. Well, sort of. A pure democracy has never actually existed on any large scale. In fact, the large scale of it all may be the problem. In a clan or village model, we tend to find more just people groups who pay attention to the needs of others, that are more honest, more responsible, and more respectful in their disagreements. So, does that completely solve the problem of what true objective justice is? No. Is there a God who knows the measure of true justice? Maybe. Is it even possible for finite humans to know if this infinite God has a measure and what that measure is? Absolutely not. So let's go back to Keller's article. Many secular people, those pesky seculars, I add, respond to McIntyre by saying, we don't need any basis for human rights because everyone knows that care for the rights of others is just common sense. Below is an excerpt from a dialogue interview, slightly edited by Keller, between Christian Smith, author of Atheist Outreach, and an atheist on a podcast called Life After God. Smith: there is a difference between having an instinct that is wrong to let people starve without helping them. It is another thing to insist that we ought to make the sacrifices, often huge sacrifices, necessary to prevent the suffering. If people says, why should we help others? What happens beyond our borders is not our problem. What does the secular person say to them? The standard is not, do we have a regime to force people to sacrifice for others, but do we have a basis for persuading a reasonable skeptic who asks, why should I care about them? Do you have not only an explanatory rationale for why letting people starve is wrong, but also a justifying motivation so that they are motivated to make the sacrifices necessary to help them? Without both, you can't have a set of moral values prevail in a society. And if you are strictly secular, I don't think you have them. I'm not saying atheists can't choose to be good, but when they do so, it is an arbitrary subjective preference, not a rationally grounded view that has persuasive power over others. This is the atheist responding to what Smith just said. That does not make sense to me. I just figure that because people are human beings, that they should be treated fairly. I know what it feels like to be treated with kindness and with meanness. I know that others feel the same way, so I want to treat them with dignity and respect because that is what I would want. I don't have an objective source for the dignity of people. It is based on the fact that I would want to be treated this way. Why isn't that compelling to a reasonable skeptic? Why do I need more reason or justification than that? It seems common sense. Smith's reply: I don't think it is reasoning that is at work here. That's not an argument, it's a sensibility. And those kind of sensibilities about love and human rights are riding on the continued currents of some millennia of a cultural inheritance that is powerfully influenced by Christianity and Judaism. That is what makes these ideals make sense to you. If I worry about anything, I worry about this. These moral ideals of loving your neighbor and honoring her human rights regardless of who they are or where they are make sense to us now. But if they are, as I think can be demonstrated, based on the cultural inheritance of religion, based on the worldview that our culture used to have, then will these moral ideals make sense to our grandchildren as religion continues to decline? Won't they just ask, sure, I care about my not suffering, but why should I care about someone else's not suffering? Secularism has no good answer to that question. The atheist is saying to Smith that it is common sense or rational to say, I want to be treated this way, therefore I ought to treat others that way. Smith says that is not reasoning. You may feel that the golden rule is right, but why should someone else feel the same way you do about it? Okay, that was a lengthy chunk. First off, I hate that Keller made the choice to only give an excerpt in which the atheist only said one thing casually, and then there was a response to the response the atheist had to Smith was not shared. I'd say this seems unjust, but I fear Tim Keller would creep up behind me and shout, "But where do you get that right to express what you think justice is? Say God, or I will keep asking you." In all seriousness, to be fair, in the limited exchange, the atheist is talking more about human empathy, and Smith is more concerned with solving a theoretical conundrum. These two things are distinct. However, it could certainly be argued that empathy, or as Smith calls it, sensibility, is more important than connecting every intellectual dot in this conversation. Not that we can't walk and chew gum at the same time, but I frankly could care less about people that lack empathy on basics because they haven't been able to justify being a good person. This is important to say. When a child asks why repeatedly, regardless of your answer, that can quickly become what all this philosophical language is, in essence. If you want a definition for every word everyone says all the time, you're honestly kind of an asshole and are going to live a lonely life. Now, thought experiments are fun, and wanting to define terms when discussing essential topics of humanity is normal and wise, but it can get ridiculous, and I fear this subject devolves that way rather quickly. So let's go back to Keller. In order to compare biblical justice and the secular alternatives, below is a brief outline of the facets of biblical justice. 1. Community. Others have a claim on my wealth, so I must give voluntarily. The Bible depicts the human world as a profoundly interrelated community, so the godly must live in such a way that community is strengthened. Old Testament scholar Bruce Waltke puts all the teaching on the righteous in the book of Proverbs into a concise and practical principle. The righteous, Sadiq is the Hebrew word, are willing to disadvantage themselves to advantage the community. The wicked are willing to disadvantage the community to advantage themselves. The gleaning laws of the Old Testament are case in point. Landowners were commanded to not maximize profits by harvesting all sheaves or picking all the olives or grapes. Instead, the owner was to leave produce in the field for the worker and the poor to take through their labor, not through charity. When the text reads that sheaves, olives, and grapes shall be for the poor, it is a Hebrew phrase that indicates ownership. To treat all your profits and assets as individualistically yours is mistaken. Because God owns all your wealth, you are a steward of it. The community has some claim on it. Nevertheless, it is not to be confiscated. You are to acknowledge the claim and voluntarily be radically generous. The view of property does not fit well with either a capitalist or socialist economy. Okay, well, I certainly agree with Keller that properly interpreting the Bible will not leave you thinking it commands capitalism. I am also not a particularly socialist person, though I could argue there is much stronger socialist biblical cases than capitalist ones, but I'm more concerned with one interpretive issue here. Keller states that the owner was to leave produce in the field for the workers and the poor to take through their labor, not through charity. When the text reads the sheaves, olive, and grapes shall be for the poor, it uses a Hebrew phrase and that indicates ownership. Keller lies there. Or maybe his Hebrew is better than mine, but best I can tell, the phrase used would literally be translated to take it, to live. I see that might imply ownership, but I could just as easily say that it also implies charity. To claim that this is for workers only, which is what Keller does subtly, is a mere attempt to support his biases. In fact, the full context he is referencing in Deuteronomy does explicitly demand charity. Quote, when you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back and get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord God may bless you in all the work of your hands. Keller actually has been found guilty and kind of often of these seemingly small fibs. And it's quite aggravating and unnecessary if you're trying to make reputable points. But I fear that's not Keller's goal. He wants to be right more than he wants to be accurate. While he acknowledges that property is non-existent in Scripture because it all belongs to God, he's not technically wrong about that, but he doesn't go far enough. He stops short of give it all away, which is what the Bible teaches, so that Christians can conveniently wrestle with their capitalist urges rather than full-on reject them. He goes on. Equity. Everyone must be treated equally and with dignity. Leviticus 24:22, you are to have the same law for the foreigner as the native-born. The Hebrew word Mezraim means equity, and Isaiah 33:15 says those who speak with equity keep their hands from accepting bribes. Bribery is unjust because in commerce, law, and government, it does not treat the poor the same as it does the wealthy. Any system of justice or government in which decisions or outcomes are determined by how much money parties have is a stench before God. Another example of inequity is unfair business practices. Leviticus 19:13 and Deuteronomy 24:14-15 speak of unfair wages. Amos 6:5-6 speaks of unjust scales, selling even the sweepings with the wheat. To cut corners and to provide an inferior product in order to make more money, but not serve customers is to do injustice. Okay, no arguments here from me. So, but I will say, what Keller is describing, it sounds like America is pretty systemically unjust according to these standards. So let's see if that's Keller's conclusion later. 3. Corporate responsibility. I am sometimes responsible for and involved in other people's sins. Sometimes God holds families, groups, and nations corporately responsible for the sins of individuals. Daniel repents for sins committed by his ancestors, even though there is no evidence he personally participated in them in Daniel 9. In 2 Samuel 21, God holds Israel responsible for injustice done to the Gibeonites by King Saul, even though he was by that time dead. In Joshua 7 and Numbers 16, God holds whole families responsible for the sins of one member. In 1 Samuel 15:2 and Deuteronomy 23:3-8, he holds members of the current generation of a pagan nation responsible for the sins committed by their ancestors many generations before. Why? There are 3 reasons. First reason is corporate responsibility. Achan's family, Joshua 7, did not do the stealing, but they helped him become the kind of man who would steal. The Bible's emphasis on the importance of family for character formation implies the rest of the family cannot wholly avoid responsibility for the behavior of one member. Second reason is corporate participation. Sinful actions not only shape us, but the people around us. And when we sin, we affect those around us, which reproduces sinful patterns, even if more subtle over generations. So, as in Exodus 25, God punishes sin down to the generations because usually later generations participate in one form or another in the same sin. Third reason is institutionalized sin. Socially institutionalized way of life become weighted in favor of the powerful and oppressive over those with less power. Examples include criminal justice system, commercial practices such as high interest loans, or unfairly low or delayed wages. Once these systems are in place, they do more evil than any one individual within the system may intend or even be aware of. Okay. Whew. You can see here how Keller can be the favorite of the centrist Christian who wants to appear progressive. I agree with all the points he just made. You do not have to think that hard to realize this would apply to things such as capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. Let's see if this is where Keller lands in his critiques later. 4. Individual responsibilities. I am responsible for all my sins, but not all my outcomes. The Bible does not teach that your success or failure is wholly due to your individual choices. Poverty, for example, can be brought on by personal failure, but it may also exist because of environmental factors such as famine or plague or sheer injustice. So we are not in complete control of our life outcomes. Despite the reality of corporate responsibility and evil, the Bible insists that ultimately our salvation lies in what we do as individuals. There is an asymmetrical balance between individual and corporate responsibility. Deuteronomy 24:16 says that in ordinary human law, we must be held responsible and punished for our own sins, not those of our parents. We are indeed the product of our communities, but not wholly. We can resist their patterns. Ezekiel 18 is a case study in what can happen if we put too much emphasis on corporate responsibility. It leads to fatalism and irresponsibility. The reality of corporate sin does not swallow up individual moral responsibility, nor does individual responsibility disprove the reality of corporate evil. To deny or largely deny either is to adopt one of the secular views of justice rather than a biblical one. Okay, so I was agreeing with so much of what Keller was saying until that last sentence. Yes, there is a balance between being a product of your circumstances and having an ability to respond and the wisdom to ask others to hold you accountable. Yet, Christians, much less the Bible, gets to claim ownership of this view of justice. I'd even argue that more non-Christians than evangelicals actually strike a good balance of personal responsibility and understanding systemic inequality. In other words, Keller gets it exactly backwards, or at least upside down. Whether or not the Bible teaches proper balance, it is absolutely absurd to say that non-Christian justice theories either only emphasize personal responsibility or only emphasize systemic failure. It's simply not true. And it is at least ignorant to believe that it's true, if not more nefariously a carefully crafted straw man erected as a bolster to a weak argument of Keller's that we need more evangelicalism in order to be more fair moral people. He goes on to advocacy. This is the fifth point in what the Bible teaches about justice. We must have a special concern for the poor and marginalized. While we are not to show partiality to any, we are to have special concern for the powerless. This is not a contradiction. Proverbs 31, 8-9 says, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, defend the rights of the poor and needy. The Bible doesn't say speak up for the rich and powerful, not because they are less important as persons before God, but because they don't need you to do this. The playing field is not level, and if we don't advocate for the poor, there will not be equality. In this aspect of justice, we are seeking to give more social, financial, and cultural capital, power, to those with less. Jeremiah 22:3 says, protect the person who is being cheated from the one who is mistreating foreigners, orphans, and widows. Jeremiah is singling out for protection groups of people who cannot protect themselves from mistreatment of the ways of sin. No disagreements here from me. Again, Keller appealing to those progressive needs well here, backing it up with seemingly solid Bible references. So let's continue. In briefly outlining the alternative accounts of justice operating in our culture, some oversimplification is unavoidable. Still, there is a widespread agreement that something like the following four categories of justice theories are operating. All the theories on the spectrum are secular, sharing two assumptions. First, unlike MLK Jr., they are all assuming that there are no transcendent moral absolutes on which to base justice. They believe in Taylor's immanent frame, that there is no supernatural reality, and so moral values and the definition of justice itself are invented by human beings. They all see human nature as a blank slate that can be wholly reshaped by human means, not a God-given nature that must be honored in order to thrive. Okay, so I must quickly interject to identify a key problem in this discussion. The way it is framed as secular versus not is a problematic framing. By saying the word secular, Keller seems to be more specifically addressing irreligious, materialist rationalist. I would say that there are such things as secular spiritualist, humanist, and others who do not fit in the framework that Keller is building. Worse than that, he's claiming the only alternative is Christianity. What about other religions? I understand he can't address all ideologies of all people groups, but then don't set up an either-or paradigm when talking about justice. There are people who drink what C.S. Lewis called the poison of subjectivity, and it's slightly nonsensical to claim that there are no moral absolutes, but that is not what humans usually do. Humanism typically highlights that those absolutes are not knowable. This lack of certainty is a much humbler demeanor than the Christian assumption that they can know at least most, if not all, moral absolutes. The shameless and not name dropping that Keller does of MLK is it's easy to spot, and it's cringy. King hated and would hate the present white evangelical cult, especially if they were steadfast in their desire to distinguish secular and Christian approaches to social justice. Martin Luther King Jr. believed in collaboration more than any other civil rights leader in history. Secularists do not view humans as a blank slate to be molded, but as complex creatures whose exponential factors and circumstance, education, and daily experiences make any kind of morality a living and progressing task, not a fixed rule book that can never change or adjust. After this paragraph, Keller shows a spectrum of individualism to collectivism. It's a picture from the furthermost left point of individualism to the right. He plots these four ideologies. Libertarian. Justice is basically about freedom. Next is liberal justice, which is justice is basically about fairness towards the center towards the collective end. He doesn't actually have a center. He has nothing in the middle. Towards the collectivism's end of the spectrum, he lists utilitarianism. Justice is basically about happiness. And finally, postmodern justice is basically about power. The spectrum's not complete, but I see his meaning, and I don't think he's entirely off base. So we'll keep moving on to Keller's further elaboration of these supposed supposedly secular views, contrasted with his interpretations of Scripture. So the first one, libertarian, the freedom ethic. A just society promotes individual freedom. This view, recently argued by Robert Nozick, believes that in a small number of individual rights, but not entitlements, persons have the right to not be harmed, an absolute right to private property if fairly earned, and to the rights of free speech and free association. The first way to guard these rights is to have small government, since high taxes are unjust. A violation of the right to private property and large-scale government inevitably seeks to regulate speech, thought, and association. The second way to guard these rights is to have an unregulated free market. The libertarian view is highly individualistic, based on the implicit assumption that every human being belongs to him or herself, and that the outcomes of anyone's life depend wholly on their individual choices and efforts. First, this view denies the complexity of who we are, individuals yet embedded in communities instituted by God, family, and state, and created in the image of a three-in-one God. The Bible balances individual freedom with community obligation. Unlike the Bible, libertarianism denies and downplays the role of oppressive social forces and what makes people poor, refusing to see how sin creates unlevel playing fields and that mere individual freedom cannot remedy. Second, it denies the doctrine of the universality of sin. It sees evil capacities of government, but not so much of capital markets, though human sin is everywhere and will corrupt everything. Third, it has a sub-biblical understanding of freedom. Libertarianism usually sees freedom in wholly negative terms. It is freedom from. But we were created by God for loving him and loving our neighbor, not just self-interest, and so the more we do what we are created to do, the more free we will be. Finally, this view's understanding of absolute rights over property and over self does not square with what the Bible's view of creation says. We belong to God, not ourselves, and so does everything we own. Whatever we have is ultimately God's gift and must be shared. Okay. Whew. I like these critiques Keller offers of libertarianism, or frankly, American conservative rhetoric. I likely would have said similar things when I was a Christian. I'm not sure how many other Presbyterians in this denomination would love this, but he is sticking to his guns in tough waters, so I'll give him kudos for these critiques at least. Let's see what he has to say about liberal justice. So for liberalism, fairness, a just society promotes fairness for all. This view, more recently argued by John Rawls, greatly expands the idea of human rights into what libertarians would call entitlements. Liberals add to freedom rights, right to speech, property, and religion, also social or economics right to education, to medical care. Rawls' justification for such rights goes like this. He argues that if people had to devise a society from behind a veil of ignorance, not knowing where they would be placed, not knowing what race, gender, social status, etc. they would be, that everyone would, out of pure rational self-interest, design one in which there were significant legal measures to redistribute wealth to those who were born in poor communities and to establish many other economic and social rights. Only that kind of society would be fair and rational. Once it is established that economic and social rights are valid, then, in the liberal view, there is no need in society for any consensus on moral values, no need to all agree on what good is. Rather, honoring individual human rights becomes the only necessary moral standard, and denying them the only sin. Then people will be free to live their lives pursuing whatever they believe they're good. A major difference from the libertarian view is that now it is just and fair for the state to redistribute wealth through taxation and governmental control of the market. Nevertheless, Rawls and liberals still believe that some kind of free market was the best way to grow the wealth of society, and that then could be shared justly. The reason that liberals are basically still friendly to capitalism is that ultimately this view is still highly individualistic, giving individuals freedom to create their own good and meaning and morality. So liberalism still aims not for equal outcomes, but equal opportunity for individuals to achieve their happiness. Individual outcomes are still seen as determined by individual efforts and work ethic. As much recent scholarship has demonstrated, liberalism's belief in human rights and care for the people are grounded in Christianity. The scholars argue that these beliefs depend on a view of the individual as having infinite dignity and worth, of individuals as being created, regardless of race, gender, and class. This belief only arose in cultures influenced by the Bible and marked by the belief in a creator God. They also show that these Judeo-Christian beliefs do not fit with the modern secular view that there are no moral absolutes and that humanity is strictly the product of evolution. The conclusion is that these older beliefs in human dignity are essentially smuggled into secular modern culture. This means that Christians can agree with much in this justice theory. Nevertheless, as McIntyre showed, there are contradictions and fatal flaws in liberalism's approach to justice. First, the freedom of the individual has become a de facto absolute that vetoes all other things, and unlike in more traditional societies, liberal societies have not been able to balance individual freedom and obligation to family and community. The result has been the dissolution of families, neighborhoods, and institutions. It turns out, without a set of shared moral values, besides a commitment to individual freedom, and without a shared story of who we are corporately as a people, a society cannot keep from fragmenting. Because liberalism has been the dominant justice theory, the current tribalism, unprecedented loss of social trust, and breakdown of institutions can be seen as a failure of liberalism. Some argue that liberalism worked in a society only when religion remained strong, but it could offset the selfishness that individualism fosters, and it could provide the sense of solidarity and community that individualism cannot give. Now that religion is in sharp decline, the balance is gone. Second, if justice is just honoring individual rights and entitlements and there are no higher moral absolutes, how can we adjudicate matters when rights claims conflict and contradict as they do so often? Another problem with liberalism is that people's rights claims often contradict. Liberalism has no way to determine if some rights may take precedent over others. In the feminist versus transgender debate, who wins and on what basis? Loudest voice, most money. Third, even secular critics point out that rationality is an insufficient basis for a fair society. Many critics of Rawls have observed that if your only motivation is rational self-interest, those behind the veil of ignorance would still not have to agree to entitlements. The number of poor is a minority, and chances are you won't be one. So why not take a risk by setting up a society that exploits the poor to advantage the rest of the rest of society? Why not opt for that as long as you aren't likely to be poor yourself? Exploiting the poor can be definitely be seen as rational self-interest, but if liberals want to respond that exploiting the poor is wrong, they've taken away their right to do that because they deny more absolutes. Who is to say that exploiting the poor might not be, in a cost-benefit analysis, more practical than not? There are then no real guardrails to keep a liberal society from moving towards oppression. Finally, a liberal's insistence that religious views stay out of public discourse is hypocritical. It tells religious people they must not argue from their faith beliefs, but only use public reason or rational self-interest, all the while smuggling their own beliefs on human nature, rights, sexualities, and many other things that are faith assumptions left over from our Christian past, and not the deliverance of science. Okay, whew. There is so much mentioned in this section. I could probably spend a whole episode deconstructing it. Way too many assumptions, meddled with important social commentary that's accurate. So there's so much truthful reflection as well as erroneous propaganda. This is where parsing will become exhausting but important. Firstly, liberalism is actually by definition more about freedom than fairness. The first dictionary definition, liberalism, is willingness to respect or accept behavior or opinions different from one's own. It's an openness to new ideas. In politics, it's the social philosophy that promotes individual rights, civil liberties, democracy, and free enterprise. Heavy government regulation is typically a democratic socialist tendency, not necessarily a liberal's. This brings me to the most important point of all. The word liberal is mostly unhelpful modern day because it has been often redefined, pejoratively used, and radically shifts in definition depending on the contextual field. Christian liberalism, American liberalism, philosophical liberalism all mean crazy different things, and they have important distinctions in their description. So that's issue one, but let's cede Keller's term just for the sake of expediency now. He is right in places where he critiques its inconsistency and failures. I think Malcolm X did a much better job than Keller at pointing to the problems of liberals, or at least white liberals. Malcolm X once said, in this deceitful American game of power politics, the Negroes And by the way, I feel uncomfortable saying Negroes, but I actually asked a friend about this. If I'm quoting Malcolm X and I say the word Negroes, it's not inflammatory for me to say it. I reflected on it, but I'm saying that word because I think it's necessary. I'm going to say that word again, and it's not going to be Malcolm X saying it. And I want you to hear the difference in how it's used, because I think that's actually really profitable. So this is from Malcolm X. He says, "In this deceitful American game of power politics, the Negroes, the race problem, the integration of civil rights issues are nothing but tools used by one group of whites called liberals and another group of whites called conservatives, either to get into power or to remain in power. Among whites here in America, the political teams are no longer divided into Democrats and Republicans. The whites, who are now struggling for control of the American political throne, are divided into liberal and conservative camps. The white liberals from both parties cross party lines to work together toward the same goal, and white conservatives from both parties do likewise. The white liberal differs from the white conservative only in one way. The liberal is more deceitful than the conservative. The liberal is more hypocritical than the conservative. Both want power, but the white liberal is the one who has perfected the art as posing as the Negro's friend and benefactor, and by winning the friendship, allegiance, and support of the Negro, the white liberal is able to use the Negro as a pawn or tool in this political football game that is constantly raging between the white liberals and white conservatives. Politically, the American Negro is nothing but a football, and the white liberals control their mentally dead ball through tricks of tokenism, false promises of integration, and civil rights. In this profitable game of deceiving and exploiting the politician of the American Negro, those white liberals have the willing cooperation of the Negro civil rights leaders. These leaders sell out our people for just a few crumbs of token recognition and token gains. These leaders are satisfied with token victories and token progress because they themselves are nothing but token leaders." And Malcolm X was right. This version of liberalism only promises more rights and more fairness, but will never provide such, while white supremacy is the power behind everything in this country. But according to Timothy Keller, I'm using the postmodern lens to critique a liberal one. Therefore, it's all secular and not true justice like Christian biblical justice is. Malcolm X, at the time of the quote, was by no means secular. He is a great example of a figure in history who was willing to evolve in his morals, spirituality, and inclusion while still being properly concerned with injustice at each stage of his life. Most unfair of all, he was shot for what he said, likely by a radically religious group, not a secular one. This is why the claim Keller makes that liberalism has somehow stole or appropriated its ethics from Christianity is somewhat laughable either way. If it has, perhaps that's the problem. If it hasn't, perhaps that's where it got things right. His vague reference to scholars making this connection makes me roll my eyes. Most scholars would not believe that liberalism is based in any kind of Christianity. It is an entirely separate thing. In fact, one of the founders of the PCA, Keller's denomination, wrote vehemently against liberalism and Christianity. After all, and he hated any form of liberalism and Christianity, often citing it's often cited as a reason for a large split. Gresham Machen, the guy who wrote the book Christianity and Liberalism and pitted them against each other, he said, "In the sphere of religion, as in other spheres, the thing about which men are afraid are apt to be the things that are least worth holding. The really important things are the things about which men will fight." And fight he did. Machen was quite racist. According to a 1913 letter Machen wrote himself, he actively opposed the integration of colored man, to quote him, to Princeton Seminary, and refused to sit at the same table as them at Princeton. Machen expressed his, quote, direct quote, anger to hear people talking glibly about equal civil rights of Negroes. Machen said his opponent to segregation was B.B. Warfield and said, quote, "I have talked to a number of members of the faculty. They all sympathize with me." Machen argued that his view was supported by, quote, "the facts of human nature," and after hours of arguing with Warfield, Machen said in frustration that Warfield was bitterly lacking in appreciation of human nature. So, Perhaps American Presbyterians didn't split over liberalism in as much as they split over how they viewed black people. Perhaps using an intellectually sounding word or phrase like liberalism or critical race theory, which is being scapegoated to attack something else Christians don't like. Perhaps over 100 years later, there are quiet parts not being said in public, but are in private. Per-fucking-haps. Keller's flippant example of the turf debate within feminist circles in order to point out liberalism is inconsistent leads me to believe that he doesn't view liberalism as particularly masculine. But angry nitpicking assumptions I make aside, the most inaccurate or at least incomplete accusation Keller makes is that liberalism does not want religion in the discourse. In politics, liberal America wants all religion to be treated equally, rather than to have one favored so heavily, such as white Christianity. Plenty of Christians do not proof text, and many spiritual leaders, both in the past and now, have important things to contribute, and I believe liberalism, for the most part, encourages more seats, not less, at the table. So while liberalism has plenty of problems, I'm not sure Keller identifies them correctly. It is fair to critique anyone who is individualistic in their philosophies, but then critique the individualism aspect. There's more I'd like to say about this, but for the sake of time, we must keep going. Utilitarian. Happiness. A just society maximizes the great happiness for the great number. This third theory, associated with John Stuart Mill, is not as influential in former jurisprudence, and yet its basic idea makes a great deal of intuitive sense to secular people. Arguably, utilitarianism dominates most public discourse over public policy and lies behind many individual justice claims. In this view, the essence of justice is the greatest happiness for the greatest number. This is another effort to have justice grounded not in moral absolutes but in some kind of practical rationality. If something makes the majority of people happy, then it is just. But where are the guardrails? Does it mean that anything the majority desires for happiness is okay? Utilitarians use the quote-unquote harm principle to create limits. They argue that people should be free to pursue whatever makes them happy as long as it doesn't harm others. It is obvious, however, that there will be inevitable clashes over what makes people happy, and so the final arbiter of utilitarians is majority rule. Today, the news media relies heavily on utilitarianism when it argues, explicitly or implicitly, that polls tell us that most Americans now favor X, and therefore X is now okay. Utilitarianism is not as individualistic as the first two theories of justice. It is majoritarian. Indeed, many utilitarians see individual rights as barriers to majority happiness. If you believe in human rights, you are probably not a utilitarian. First, without a doctrine of creation, this view does not honor individuals as having a dignity that must not be violated. Could the majority of a national populace define their happiness in such a way that it can only be achieved if a minority of the population is put in internment camps? On the premises of utilitarianism, that could easily be argued, and it was, in Nazi Germany and even in the US with regards to Japanese Americans during World War II. Second, without a doctrine of sin, it naively assumes that what will make the majority happy can't be something evil. Just because something makes a person happy, it doesn't mean it is right to do. Lots of foolish and cruel things can make us happy. Also, without an understanding of humans as souls and bodies, this view assumes happiness can be delivered by providing material goods and wealth and pleasures, when long-term wisdom across cultures has recognized that this is inadequate for real happiness. Finally, the harm principle is useless as any that's what he says, is useless as any guide or as a barrier to abuse. The moment you say something is harmful, you are rooting your statement in some view of human nature, how human beings ought to live, and in some understanding of right and wrong. To say that something doesn't harm anyone is based on some view of human nature and human purpose that is ultimately a matter of faith. Defenders of Jim Crow laws often use utilitarian arguments and the harm principle, telling African Americans that segregation was not harmful, but was for their good. Without any moral absolutes, who is to say what is good for a minority? The majority, not the minority, gets to define it. Okay. Keller is criminal here in his characterization. He almost nails it until he claims that utilitarians don't believe in human rights. As I alluded to earlier, utilitarian ethics are often reflected upon in eras later and seen to be problematic, but utility is precisely about that, function, not form. Utilitarians are sidestepping the discussion and stating that the discussion is not as important as what is practical. I tend to think both the theoretical and practical are important and shouldn't necessarily be pitted against each other, but Keller seems to think utilitarianism, or utilitarianists at least, are apathetic, and I don't think that's fair. In fact, human rights, such as the right to speak, the right to nourish oneself with both water and food, the right to take up space, these rights are wanted by the majority of people. The disagreements come in the methodology more than in the beliefs. People who do not think food is a human right mostly exist in certain ideologies of the U.S., not worldwide. Now, the harm principle can certainly be a moot point in a philosophical sense. Individuals and people groups are not all going to be unanimous in their estimation of what constitutes as harmful, but they don't have to be in perfect agreement. It is not a letter of the law type situation, but through both intuition and democratic wisdom, an understanding that hurting people should be avoided as best as possible. Practically speaking, some vote out of a utilitarian ethic because they want to reduce harm despite not liking the entirety or even a majority of a person's platform or a policy's wording. Now, is that the only acceptable ethic when voting? I don't think so. But it is important to not put utilitarianism where it does not belong. Few people, and probably not many systems, place utility as a pragmatic necessity, not an ultimate guidance for all philosophical questions. It is primarily in Christian dualism that deep, profound theological backing be required for every thought and action, not out here in the normal world. Let's continue. The fourth group. Postmodern. Power. A just society subverts the power of dominant groups in favor of the oppressed. The fourth justice theory, in some ways, is the newest on the scene, though it has an older pedigree. Drawing on the teaching of Karl Marx, what can be called postmodern critical theory has emerged very recently with its own account of justice, which is sharply different from the others. Because it has taken shape more recently and has come onto the scene so forcefully, we will take more time to describe and interact with it. I'm going to chime in very quickly to just state that it is unfair to say that this has come out of the scene forcefully. A lot of social reckoning with our power systems has been building for decades, if not centuries. Keller sets it up as if it's trendy, not organic, and I take big issue with this framing, but let's keep on moving. Keller says that postmodern critical theory argues, first, the explanation for all unequal outcomes in wealth, well-being, and power is never due to individual actions or to differences in cultures or to differences in human abilities, but only and strictly due to unjust social structures and system. The only way to fix unequal outcomes for the downtrodden is through social policy, never by asking anyone to change their behavior or culture. Okay, yikes. Flag on the play for flagrant straw manning and exaggerating here. Critical theory, but this is the term Keller's using. Critical theory is a philosophical approach to culture, and especially to literature, that seeks to confront the social, historical, and ideological forces and structures that produce and constrain it. The approach to analyzing culture and history does indeed focus on both individual and corporate accountability. To act like it believes that individuals never do anything wrong is a lie and silly. No one teaches that with any seriousness. There, might be a problematic sect of modern psychology that sometimes fails to mention personal responsibility as much as it should, but that isn't even remotely related to critical theory. Also, I find it interesting that Keller is talking about critical theory and supposedly not about critical race theory. CRT is the hotter button issue, the hot buttoner issue, the hottest button issue, the hotter button, whatever. CRT is the hotter button issue at the time of this writing. CT has been around for a long time. Critical theory. I mean, my belief is Keller is trying to avoid using the word race because he's a white guy and doesn't want to be called out as racist, and fair enough. I'd like to not be called racist either when I talk about things, but even so, I don't think I have racist ideology anymore, while I fear what Keller is going to propagate further on is at best, racially insensitive and ignorant. He goes on. Second, and this is what he thinks critical theory is. Second, all art, religion, philosophy, morality, law, media, politics, education, and forms of the family are determined not by reason or truth, but by social forces as well. Everything is determined by your class consciousness and social location. Religious doctrine, together with all politics and law, are always, at bottom, a way for people to get or maintain social status, wealth, and therefore power over others. And I mean, in fairness to Keller, a lot of this is, true. But, it's because it's true. Keller would likely not be a Christian pastor if he was born in a different country to different parents with a different culture. That's a little bit more whataboutism than I prefer to engage in, but it can be extremely important to point out the social factors that mold us. In fact, I'd rather meditate on butterfly effects on my life than assuming everything I do was divinely prescribed by a God who doesn't care enough to explain his actions to me in detail. Keller goes on. Third, according to CT, reality is at bottom nothing but power. I hate how he keeps saying at bottom. Is at bottom nothing but power. And if that is the case, then to see reality, power must be mapped through the means of intersectionality, the categories of race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, and sometimes others. If you are a white male, straight, cisgender, then you have the highest amount of power. If you are none of these at all, you are the most marginalized and oppressed, and there are numerous categories in the middle. More importantly, each category towards the powerless end of the spectrum has a greater moral authority and a greater ability to see the way truly things are. Why can none of these guys just write normal sentences? To see the way truly things are. Only powerlessness and oppression brings moral high ground and true knowledge. Therefore, those with more privilege must not enter into any debate. They have no right or ability to advise the oppressed. Blinded as they are by their social location, they simply must give up their power. Okay. Blech. I have heard this Ben Shapiro-esque talking point multiple times. The snarkier version goes something like, a poor black lesbian trans woman in a wheelchair has the most moral authority, and a rich white straight cisgender man with no disabilities is the evilest thing imaginable. That's what it sounds like when Ben Shapiro does it. This might be the most ridiculous idea I've ever heard in my life. I mean, literally no one believes that. I don't know whether these conservative voices either idiotically or sinisterly get confused. I think maybe they get confused in that they reveal that they believe power and moral authority are the same thing. Put another way, if you were a soul floating over the waters and had to assume one of those caricature bodies, which would you choose? Well, pointing out that people of a certain type tend to have more power is doing the opposite of postulating who has moral authority. Moral authority is such a pointless idea anyways. All it should mean is trustworthiness. To make decisions that are right or good. In that sense, people in power have a track record of, trustworthiness that the powerless do not, or at least that's how the story goes. So if you take this hyperbolic example that I have heard used repeatedly, do I think all black women are always right? Well, secretly, yes. Just kidding. But obviously, I don't think all black women are right all the time. And I don't think that, and I don't know anyone who thinks that way. However, here's the distinction. Will I intuitively trust what a black woman has to say about being a black woman over what a white man has to say about being a black woman? Absolutely. And the inverse is true as well. The issue isn't the identity of a speaker, but an acknowledgement of how power has formed in our culture. It's just an observation. Do not trust people who claim that social awareness somehow threatens the fabric of society. The only folk who defend the fabric of society are the folks who benefit from the fabric of society, not those who suffer from it. And this is the important principle that critical theory and critical race theory bring to the discussion of justice. The word dribble continues. Fourth, the main way power is exercised is through language, through dominant discourses. A dominant discourse is any truth claim, whether grounded in supposed reason or science or in religion and morality. Language does not merely describe reality, it constructs or creates it. Power structures mass themselves behind the language of irrationality and truth. So academia hides its unjust structures behind talks of academic freedom, and corporations behind talk of free enterprise. Science behind talk of empirical objectivity, and religion behind talk of divine truth. All of these seeming truth claims are really just constructed narratives designed to dominate, and as such, they must be unmasked. Reasoned debate and freedom of speech, therefore, is out. It only gives unjust discourses airtime. The only way to reconstruct reality in a just way is to subvert dominant discourses, and this requires control of speech. Okay, again, Keller, you're just lying. It's a flat-out lie, or at least a severe misunderstanding. CT points out that the main way power is exercised is through violence. Language does describe and frame and potentially construct, but language that is problematic is the language that supports or permits violence. Put another way, the derogatory N-word used to oppress black people for so long was not bad because the arrangement of letters lifelessly created some sort of reality, but rather supported an already existing horrifying reality. That is why, as hip-hop and black culture has taken that word back, there is a risk for violence for the person saying it, sometimes more so than the person being hated. Accepting the word as normal led and can lead to hateful violence when white people use it to oppress, but many have found liberation and camaraderie in taking the power away from white people and using it to help create a more equitable reality to some extent, and that ideology has my full support. This is an important hair to split. Language is not the most important thing to the postmodern critical theorist. It is that deconstructing how language sustains violent systems is important work. I obviously agree with this, or I wouldn't have this podcast. Keller wants his audience to fear that their free speech is threatened. It is white Christian power that rightfully should be held accountable. There is no secret meeting to formulate a list of permissible and impermissible words. There are active efforts to educate the power of language, considering the violent systems in place that literally, physically harm people, either through direct or indirect violence. He goes on in his caricature of critical theory. He says, fifth, cultures like persons can be mapped through intersectionality. In one sense, no culture is better in any regard than any other culture. All cultures are equally valid, but people who see their cultures are as better and judge other cultures as inferior, or even people who see their own culture as normal and judge other cultures as exotic, are members of an oppressive culture, and oppressive cultures are, though the word is not used, inferior and to be despised. Frankly, I don't know what on earth Keller is pointing at. I've never heard, seen, or read any discussions about cultures being equal in the way that he's describing, other than like general acknowledgments that we are all human beings who deserve a level of dignity. And if that's the idea that bothers Keller, well, I suppose he is just admitting his bigotry. Go call a culture exotic if you want, Keller. Also, since you think this is like a hot take, I do find oppressive cultures to be morally inferior to oppressed ones. I know, crazy. Anyways, He goes on, finally, neither individual rights nor individual identity are primary. Traditional liberal emphasis on individual human rights, private property, free speech is an obstacle to the radical changes society will need society will need to undergo in order to share wealth and power. And it is an illusion to think that as an individual you can carve out an identity in any way different or independent of others in your race, ethnicity, gender, or so on. Group identity and rights are the only real ones. Guilt is not assigned on the basis of individual actions, but on the basis of group membership and social racial status. I know I sound like a broken record by this point, but no one believes this. I mean, maybe some immature Instagram shit posters, but no one thinks all black people have to agree on everything or that all white people deserve to be treated as slave owners. No one believes that. The truth is that while critical theory is primarily concerned with the collective, it does not have the ability to diminish the individual. Again, critical theory primarily approaches culture and history with a critical lens, trying to observe and acknowledge who had power and how the power was sustained. You can be a unique, beautiful individual and still find power structures, important systems to deconstruct. The caricature is insulting and silly. Keller knows how to dress it up as intellectual, but this is just whiny conservative. I don't want people to mention I'm white, and they better not bring up how I've been affected by it or benefited from it. Let's see what he thinks. He goes on. The next section's about what the Bible has to say about all this. This should be funny. Keller goes, in response to critical theory, according to him. First, it is deeply incoherent. If all truth claims and justice agendas are socially constructed to maintain power, then why aren't the claims and agendas of the adherents of this view subject to the same critique? Why are the postmodern justice advocates... Oh gosh, his grammar is so bad. Sorry, I had to reread this. Why are the postmodern justice advocates claim that this oppression unquestionably morally right is unquestionably morally... Man, he really needs to hire an editor. It's like, why? But the essence of what he's saying is, why are social justice warriors, is what he's saying without saying. Why do they get to say that this is oppression, while all other moral claims are mere social constructs? And if everyone is blinded by class consciousness and social location, why aren't they? Intersectionality claims oppressed people see things clearly, but why would they if social forces make us wholly what we are and control how we understand reality? Are they less formed by social forces than others? And if all people with power, who quote-unquote call the shots, socially, culturally, economically, and control public discourse, inevitably use it for domination, then if any revolutionaries were able to replace the oppressors at the top of society, why would they not become people that should subsequently be rebelled against and replace themselves? What would make them different? The postmodern account of justice has no good answers for this question. You cannot insist that all morality is culturally constructed and relative and then claim that your moral claims are not. This is not a flaw that only Christians can see, and this may therefore be a fatal flaw in the entire theory. Okay. So, firstly, it's funny that that first paragraph under the heading, Quick Biblical Analysis, didn't bring up the Bible, or really any Orthodox doctrine. Secondly, all I read, basically, in all of that was, let me lazily turn the argument back on them, whoever they are, and say they're the bad guys, not me. They think they know everything because they said I don't. To be more charitable, if Keller is worried that educational institutions are going to be hypocritical for calling out unjust systems, he is right. Higher education lends itself to toxic ideologies of elitism and pessimism. However, hypocrisy among some educators doesn't disprove the theory, nor is that hypocrisy indicating of people who are critical of culture and history. In fact, some of the most self-aware, humble folk I have ever met concern themselves with how power structures work. Keller goes on. Second, it is far too simplistic. The postmodern view of justice follows Razou and Marx, who saw human beings as inherently good or blank slates. Any evil is instilled in us by society, by social systems, and forces. So any pathology, poverty, crime, violence, and abuse is due to one thing only, wrong social policy. But biblically, We know that we are complex beings, socially, both individual and social creatures made in the image of a 3-in-1 God, morally, both sinful and fallen, yet valuable in the image of God, and constitutionally, we are equally soul, spirit, and body. The reason for evil and for unjust outcomes in life are multiple and complex. So, for example, the restoration of a poor community will require a rich, multidimensional understanding of human flourishing. Oh, there certainly is a need for social reform and the dismantling of systemic injustice, but people also need meaning in life and strong families and ways to grow in character and healthy, functional communities and moral discipline as well. This view ignores the complexity of what makes humans thrive, and therefore its programs will not actually work to liberate oppressed people. It ignores too much of what makes us human. All right, this talking point gave me an aneurysm. I honestly didn't remember Tim Keller being this blatantly hypocritical as a person, but he essentially says, humans aren't complex because of social factors, they're complex because Christians say so. So instead of observing culture and history, we are supposed to instead throw ourselves at the mercy of specific interpretations of one book written thousands of years ago. Nothing is simple about deconstructing how power system structures and individuals function together. And at this point, it seems Keller has not actually read much about critical theory at all, but rather what other people have written about critical theory. I'm especially irked by the line, "The restoration of a poor community will require a rich, multi-dimensional understanding of human flourishing." No, it won't. It'll take money. Or let's abolish money so that there's no power if you want to be that radical. Or tax billionaires out of existence if you want to be that sane. Or let's at least put forth effort in helping the poor people in our lives instead of sitting back in easy chairs and pontificating about why poor people exist. It doesn't matter. And it doesn't help that Keller is one of the richest religious leaders alive with a net worth of approximately $1.5 million. His job is to essentially sloppily interpret scripture and state his own outdated opinions. And he goes on. It undermines our common humanity. Biblically, we are primarily individuals before God, made in his image, and secondarily members of a race nationality. The postmodern view, however, makes the one's racial or group identity primary, superseding all loyalties to the nation and to the human race as a whole. This comes close to saying that there are humanities rather than a common human race. Okay, if I remember correctly, it was primarily white Christian colonists who constructed the concept of race. How dare any white person act like race is not an issue when their parents and grandparents likely benefited from race being made a chiefly important social issue. Critical theory is observing, not prescribing. Us postmoderns would love to do away with race distinctions as soon as meaningful discussions about reparations and equitable rights are enacted and bigoted systems are dismantled. He goes on, and therefore, fourth, it denies our common sinfulness. The Bible teaches that sin is pervasive and universal. We are each members of a race or nationality that contains much unique common grace to contribute to the world. But every culture also comes with particular sinful idolatries. No race or people group is inherently more sinful than others, but in this postmodern view of justice, groups are assigned higher or lower moral value depending on their power, and some groups are denied any redeeming characteristics at all. To see whole races as more sinful and evil than other races leads to things like the Holocaust. And there it is. The veil is lifted. Tim Keller is stoking fears that there will be a white genocide. He does it subtly and somewhat tactfully, but this is white nationalist propaganda, if for no other reason than that one paragraph. He falsely claims that the Holocaust was a result of simple-minded folk all agreeing that Jews were academically seen as bad and thus exterminated. In reality, Hitler rose to power because poor economic conditions allowed white Germans to be more susceptible to scapegoating a people group for their problems, and Keller is much nearer to Hitler's philosophy than critical theory is. Also, these responses to the supposed primary concern of this whole article are quoting the Bible less and less and rehashing Republican talking points more and more. He's hardly mentioned any Bible. He goes on. Fifth, it makes forgiveness, peace, and reconciliation between groups impossible. Miroslav Volv writes, forgiveness flounders because I exclude the enemy from the community of humans even as I exclude myself from the community of sinners. Without using the word sin, the adherents of this view continue to do what Wolf describes, so reconciliation flounders. Frankly, it's hard to forgive sins that an offender is not sorry for. Also, forgiveness in Scripture, spirituality, and secularism. In all of those categories, forgiveness is a personal decision for the benefit of the forgiver, more so than the benefit of the forgiven. Reconciliation is possible between communities, but it is not rushed until accountability is proven. Thus far, in the U.S., in the U.S.'s case of white supremacy, not only have no meaningful apologies been offered, but it also continues to oppress. He goes on. 6. It offers a highly self-righteous performative identity. The Christian identity is received from God's gracious hands, not achieved by our actions. We are loved absolutely apart from our performance. Contrarily, this view provides two kinds of identity that are highly performative, either being a member of an oppressed group fighting for justice or a white ally anti-racist. Both identities, like all other identities, not based in Christ, can produce anxiety because of the need to prove oneself sufficiently justice-oriented. The secure identity of Christians does not require shaming, othering, and denouncing, which is always a part of a highly performative identity. Also, the new Christian identity that we are simultaneously sinful and infinitely loved changes and heals former oppressors by telling them they are just sinners as well as former oppressed, by assuring them that they have value. See James 1, verse 9. Well, Tim, I did see James 1, verse 9. It simply says, let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation. And for that verse is talking about being exalted in the afterlife, but whatever. Either way, doesn't that verse make the case that the lowly have some moral authority? This isn't the point. My biggest problem with the point that Keller's trying to make is that Keller thinks you must either be oppressed or an ally to the oppressed to be a moral person in a postmodern view of justice. That's not, I mean, in some sense, sure. You don't have to be an activist in the street necessarily, but in as much as you are able to help the oppressed people, you should, according to his own Bible that he quoted earlier. But again, critical theory is just an approach designed to bring awareness. It's not religious dogma meant to be followed to the letter. And to be fair, performative activism is a problem, especially on social media. But critical theory advocates are the first to problematize this, not the last. Christianity, on the other hand, seems to be more about appearing righteous, or worse, pontificating about what it means to be righteous, than doing tangible good works. Keller says, finally, it is prone to domination. This theory sees liberal values such as freedom of speech and freedom of religion as mere ways to oppress people. Often this view puts these freedoms in scare quotes. As a result, adherents of this theory resort to constant expressions of anger and outrage to silence critics, as well as to censorship and other kinds of social, economic, and legal pressure to marginalize opposing views. The postmodern view sees all injustice as happening on a human level and so demonizes human beings rather than recognizing the evil forces, the world, the flesh, the devil, at work through all human life, including your own. Adherents of this view end up being utopian. They see themselves as saviors rather than recognizing that only a true divine savior will be able to finally bring in justice. When dealing with injustice, we do confront human sin, but in addition, we wrestle not merely with flesh and blood. Oh, broken record again. This is a grotesque mischaracterization. Critical theories frequently address the human urge to be a savior and the problems with demonizing the ignorant. Keller is trying to further distinguish his us from the scary them. His dogma is the only solution, as I'm sure he will go on to say. Let's see. Only biblical justice addresses all concerns of justice. Well, there you go. Found across the fragmented alternative views. Each secular theory of justice addresses one or some of the 5 facets of biblical justice mentioned above, but none addresses them all. Second, biblical justice contradicts each of the alternative views, neither by dismissing them nor by compromising with them. Biblical justice is significantly more well-grounded. It is based on God's character, a moral absolute, while the other theories are based on the changing winds of human culture. Biblical justice is more penetrating in its analysis of the human condition, seeing injustice stemming from a more complex set of causes, social, individual, environmental, spiritual, than any other theory addresses. Biblical justice provides a unique understanding of the character of wealth and ownership that does not fit into either modern categories of capitalism or socialism. Third, biblical justice has built-in safeguards against domination. As we have seen, to have a coherent theory of justice, there must be the affirmation of moral absolutes that are universal and true for all in all cultures, without appealing to some kind of non-socially constructed truth and morality. There is no way to further justice. Yet the French postmodernists were right. In the hands of human beings, truth claims tend towards totalitarianism, or at least the forces of domination readily use them. But Christianity offers truth claims that can subvert domination. How Christianity does not claim to explain all reality. Wait, what? Keller. Timothy Keller. You just said, biblical justice is the only explanation that addresses all concerns. That's a quote. You said, biblical justice is the only explanation that addresses all concerns. Then you said Christianity does not claim to explain all reality. Pick an argument. This shitty and shifty kind of rhetoric is so cultish and nonsensical, and I'm getting mad. Ooh, let's read on. He says, there is an enormous amount of mystery, things we are simply not told. We're not given any theory of everything that can explain things in terms of evolutionary biology or social forces. Reality and people are complex and at bottom, I hate that phrase, and at bottom mysterious. Christianity does not claim that if our agenda is followed, most of our problems will be fixed. Keller, seriously. This is the precise argument you've been making throughout this article. You have been setting up a paradigm where all irreligious theories of justice fall short, but the Bible somehow transcends it all and gives us not only clarity, but absolute moral truth. Yet, here you are, arguing that there's I'm gonna have a breakdown. You're arguing that there's mystery? What a cheap way to try to appear humble and dodge criticism. Fuck you, dude. God, stay consistent. Whew. Okay. I mean, am I crazy? This whole thing has been pit as like, here's the problem with secularists and their versions of justice. And that here's all the problems that their views of justice have. And he builds this whole argument about the Bible is the source of ultimate moral authority and can transcend it all. And then he just says Christianity does not claim that if our agenda is followed, most of our problems will be fixed. Then why would we follow it? You can't say that it'll fix your problems and it won't. Jesus fucking Christ. Okay, he continues. Meta-narratives have a we are the saviors complex. Christians believe that we can fight for justice in the knowledge that eventually God will put all things right. But until then, we can never expect to fully fix the world. Christianity is not utopian. Finally, the storyline of the whole Bible is God's repeated identification with the wretched, powerless, and marginalized. The central story of the Old Testament is the liberation of slaves from captivity. Over and over in the Bible, God's deliverers are usually racial and social outsiders. People seem to be weak and rejected in the eyes of the powerful elites of the world. Ugh. Now he's getting all tokenizing and flowery. This is a normal evangelical rhetorical move. Argue against the way the world does things, promise essentially nothing better, codifying codifyingly shame people who do not agree, and then humbly and emotionally express gratitude to your God for giving you all this wisdom. Fourth, I don't even know what the list is anymore. Oh, how biblical justice is better than all these. That's right. He goes on. Fourth, only biblical justice offers a radically subversive understanding of power. The postmodern view rightly critiques the liberal and other secular views as being blind to the operations of power and oppression at work in human life and society. Liberals rightly criticize the postmodern for being prone and blind to its own form of domination. Biblical justice, in contrast with the liberal, gives us a profound account of power and its corruptions, but in contrast to the postmodern, gives us a model for changing how it is used in the world. When God came to the earth in Jesus Christ, he came as a poor man to a family. At the bottom of the social order, he experienced torture and death at the hands of religious and government elites using their power unjustly to oppress. So in Jesus, we see God laying aside his privilege and power, his glory, in order to identify with the weak and helpless. And yet, through the endurance of violence and human injustice, he paid the rightful penalty of humanity's sin to divine justice. Then he was raised to even greater honor and also authority to rule. Jesus takes authority, but only after losing it in service to the weak and helpless. So the Bible does not presume an end to the binary of power. Rule and authority are not intrinsically wrong. Indeed, they are necessary for any society, but while not ending the binary, neither does Christianity simply reverse it. It does not merely fill the top rungs of authority with new parties who will use power in the same oppressive way that is the way of the world, because it is rooted in the death and resurrection of Jesus. Christianity neither eliminates nor merely reverses the ruler ruled by... He's saying the same thing over and over again. Move on. The ruler ruled binary, rather it subverts it. When Jesus saves us through his use of power only for his service, he changes our attitude toward and our use of power. There is nothing in the world like biblical justice! ! Christians must not sell their birthrights for a mess of pottage, but they must take up their birthright and do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with their God. The fucking end. Whew, okay. I'd summarize all of that conclusion, that last bit, as an attempt to make Christianity sound like the rational center of a chaotic and polarized world. An appealing pitch in times like these, but it's snake oil. That's what it is. It's snake oil. All Keller did in this really lengthy article is tickle the ears and sensibilities of both right-wing and progressive Christians. That's all he did. He recapitulating that as long as you're Christian, you're just. And as long as you're not, then you're not. I'm frustrated. I'm heartbroken and I'm sickened to know that propaganda such as this is seen as credibly academic or intellectual. There's no argument being offered here. Only a promise that their belief will save you from the chaos. And I've been promised this many times. It's not true. But if you don't submit to the theory that proper justice only comes from their book, their dogma, and their leaders, what is to stop you from leaving their control, containment, and directive to convert others? And this is the propaganda of the cult of Christianity. Thank you for subscribing for this additional content. Be sure to tell others about the cult of Christianity as well as the benefits of becoming a subscriber. Feel free to reach out to me via social media if you'd like, or leave a voice message through Anchor if you want to be featured in one of the shows. Stay safe, be smart, and have a great day.